1170, Domingo de Guzman, born at Calaruga, Castile, so he was Spanish. In time he became an Augustinian canon and adopted a life of poverty. And if you remember, we talked about two types of canons, the Augustinian canons and the Premonstarian canons, who both followed the rule of Augustine. And the significance was that the canons were a movement that started 100 years before the Dominicans and the Franciscans, but they too believed in being out with the people and going around the countryside. 1205 is a dun-dun-dun-dun date because I talked about the Albigensian Crusade a moment ago that the Pope launched against the Cathars in southern France, where the battle-hardened crusaders who had fought against Saladin and the great Muslim military forces were unleashed upon men, women, and children in southern France. Well, right before that happens, we have Dominic, who, and I've always pictured him with, you know, the pole and the little bag hanging on the end of the pole, walking around southern France. And he was walking around southern France trying to convert the heretic Catholics. But he wasn't the head of any crusader army, and the Inquisition didn't exist when he first did this. He was all by himself, and I gotta give the guy credit. He's in hostile territory. The last thing in the Languedoc region they wanted to hear was basic Catholic doctrine. They didn't want to hear it. So Dominic's walking around southern France, going into Cathar strongholds and preaching core Catholic doctrine. So I've always given the guy a lot of credit for doing that. And so it's around the time that he's doing this, the Pope decides Dominic by himself tramping around southern France ain't cutting it, it's not enough, and then the crusade is launched. But Dominic, to be fair, Dominic had nothing to do with the Albigensian Crusade. 1217, Pope Honorius III licenses the creation of the Order of Preachers, also known as the Black Friars, because they wore white robes with black capes. They were sometimes called the Dogs of the Lord, Dominicans. And later they would be known primarily as the Dominicans, after the name of the founder. At the time of Dominic's death in 1221, there were 60 Dominican monasteries. By 1237, there were over 300. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind that the original ideal of the Dominicans is you didn't need a monastery. You were out among the people, but in time they too succumbed to the lure of having the monasteries. 1233, the Dominicans were given the task of running the courts of the Inquisition. I must note, Dominic died in 1221. 1233, the Dominicans were given control of the courts of the Inquisition. So sometimes Protestant historians from the 18th and 19th century particularly picture Dominic as the first Grand Inquisitor. Not really fair. He had been dead 10 years before the courts of the Inquisition were set up. However, it is absolutely the case that the religious order that he found were indeed the first inquisitors and were the primary inquisitors all through all three phases of the Inquisition. Torquemada, who's probably the most famous inquisitor of all, was in the Spanish Inquisition. Anybody know what religious order Torquemada belonged to?
Dominican?
He sure was. He sure was a Dominican. They ran the courts of Inquisition. They took to it with great ferocity and effectiveness for the next several hundred years, and hence where the Dogs of War or Dogs of the Lord came from. Famous Dominicans of the Middle Ages included Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa Theologica, which is a kind of a Catholic version of Christian Institutes. It's an attempt to have kind of a complete theology for the Roman Catholic Church. I am now giving my personal opinion, which you need to agree with, but I think it was at that time with Thomas Aquinas that the Catholic Church started getting away from the teachings of Augustine. And so by the time of the Reformation, when Calvin and Luther came along, they said, the heck with this Aquinas guy, we should be following Augustine, who was one of the early church fathers. Aquinas was not. And so you could say you could make a case that the Protestant Reformation occurred because Thomas Aquinas wrote Summa Theologica. I mentioned Torquemada. I think Bernardo Gui was a Dominican also, but I don't absolutely know that. But that's what happened. In late 1964 and continuing into 1965, a Dominican sister who became known in Europe as Sister Smile and in the United States as the Singing Nun, wrote a series of songs to teach children about the precepts of Catholicism, and especially about the precepts of the order of the Dominicans. And she wrote these songs on her guitar, and on some of the songs she had the sisters, other sisters in the convent would sing along in the choruses. And some of these sisters were quite elderly. Some of them were in their 80s or even 90s. So it seems an odd grouping of people to become an international sensation. But in December of 1964, her song Dominique knocked the Beatles out of the #1 spot on the charts. And for 4 weeks, 5 weeks in Europe, this song was the #1 selling single in
French invasion.
The world. Dominique and Nico, the land plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. At a time when Johnny Lackland over England was a king, Dominique was in the backland fighting sin like anything. Dominique and Nico, the land he plods along and sing a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. Now a heretic one day among the thorns forced him to crawl. Dominique with just one prayer made him hear the good Lord's call. Dominique and Nico, the land he plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. Without horse or fancy wagon, he crossed Europe up and down. Poverty was his companion as he walked from town to town. Dominique and Nico, the land he plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. To bring back the straying liars and the lost sheep to the fold, he brought forth the preaching friars, heaven soldiers brave and bold. Dominique and Nico, the land he plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. One day in the budding order there was nothing left to eat. Suddenly 2 angels walked in with a loaf of bread and meat. Dominique and Nico, the land he plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. Dominique once in his slumber saw the Virgin's coat unfurled over friars without number preaching all around the world. Dominique and Nico, this land he plods along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. Grant us now, O Dominique, the grace of love and simple mirth, that we may all have the quick and godly life and truth on earth. Dominique and Nico, this land walks along and sings a little song. Never asking for reward, he just talks about the Lord, he just talks about the Lord. He just talks about the Lord. He just talks about the Lord.